Hey, hello. We're going to talk about chapter 7 here, and we're going to roll through that real quick. So here we go. So after following the American Revolution, we're going to see a period where the Americans are going to try to create their own form of government. We're going to experiment with a Republican form of government. And it's going to be, we like to pretend like it's this smooth, easy process, and it's really not. It's just a big, messy situation. And when you look at monarchy in England, monarchy is very easy to understand. You have a king, you have a queen, they're in charge, you do what they say. But when you look at republicanism or you look at a republic, it's not necessarily very difficult, but it's different. And so the Americans are going to look back in time and they're going to look at the Roman Republic for guidance for this new period of government. The Roman Republic definitely was not a democracy. If anything, it was an oligarchy. But the important part about Rome is that they had written laws. And so a republic is a nation of laws. And so this is going to be the important thing that's going to revolve around the United States. America is the land of promise and freedom and liberty and all those things. But above all that, America is a nation of laws. And it's these laws that are going to preserve things like liberty and freedom and those types of things. So when you look at democracy, this is kind of a common misconception about the United States, is that in that America is a democracy. Yes, America is a democracy in the fact that people get a say in the government, but the United States is a representative democracy in the fact that we elect people to act on our behalves. And even more than that, America is a republic. And so while a democracy is just a system in which the majority rules, this idea of a democracy can be very, very frightening, especially for people that have a lot at stake within the government. So let's say like you own, you own a home on 100,000 acres, and the majority of people decide that they're going to take your land. And give you absolutely nothing for it. That's a democracy. The majority rules. You don't have any rights. However, in a republic, you would have rights to land, because if you remember, John Locke argues that the role of a government is to protect life, liberty, and property. And so the job of that government or the republic is to protect your property from the wild swings of public opinion and madness. And so republicanism is really going to depend on the ideas of civic virtue. And so the founding fathers are really going to, the thing about the American Revolution that's going to differ from, let's say, like the French Revolution, is the fact that the American Revolution is going to be a top-down revolution. The people that are leading the country before the American Revolution are going to be the ones that are going to serve in the American government. So George Washington is really one of the primary stakeholders in the United States, and the fact that he's one of the world's one of the largest landholders in North America. John Adams, who's our nation's first vice president, second president, comes from a very wealthy family in the Boston area. Adams himself is a lawyer, but like his cousin, a distant cousin, is Samuel Adams, and the Adams were involved in shipping and receiving and all kinds of different things. So the people that are going to be active in creating this new government or leading this revolution are going to be the people that are going to be active in very well-to-do, versus like the French Revolution, in which the common people kind of get a hold of the ideas of the revolution and it rolls off of the rails because they don't have a whole lot to protect. If you're very poor during the French Revolution, you can get your hands on anything, you're going to do that, versus the American Revolution. Again, it's the wealthy kind of leading the show. And so to ensure this idea of civic virtue, a lot of states early on are going to require some sort of land ownership, voting, registration, connection. Like you have to own land, or you have to have a certain amount of property to take part in this representative government. A republic is based on the idea that majority rules with respect to minority rights. And so individual property and those types of things are protected from the will of the majority. The rule of law needs to be enforced. So once laws are created, there has to be ways to enforce them. And a republic, again, a Republican government or a republic government is a government of laws. So let's talk about women real quick. We'll just kind of change courses here. The legal status of women does not change during the American Revolution. Women help out during the American Revolution. You have individuals like Molly Pitcher that go on the battlefield and hand out water, and then at one point, mans a cannon for the American Patriots, or Betsy Ross sews the American flag, or some American colonist women are going to act as nurses or whatever during the American Revolution, create bandages and those types of things. But once the revolution comes to an end and America starts its new journey towards republicanism, women are not going to experience this political birth. They still can't run business, they can't own property. Anything they bring into a marriage is subject to the will of the husband once that marriage is legal. You have a couple things there with Abigail Adams you can watch. But she's going to argue for the rights of women, and she actually encourages her husband John Adams not to forget the ladies when piecing together the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. You have women like Judith Murray who are going to argue for the equality of education, so equal education for men and women, and these are going to be white men and women. And so basically her argument was that if a woman does not have a man to run her life, then she needs to have basic understanding of mathematics and reading and those types of things to ensure her success. Mercy Warren is going to publish pamphlets during the American Revolution arguing for basically equal rights between men and women. And she's well ahead of her time. At this point in 2022, women don't even have equal rights or guaranteed equal rights from the government at this point. Okay, all three of these women, Adams, Warren, and Murray, have the advantage of coming from a very well-to-do family, and they have money, they have education, whereas the majority of women during the American Revolution or the early days of the American Republic have very limited education, very limited literacy. They might be able to read enough to read the Bible. They might be able to do enough basic mathematics to run a household. Women were expected to raise a family and be frugal, run a budget, and instill the rights of a republic into their children, teach the values of the American Republic to them. And so because of this role, the fact that they were kind of the caretakers of the young, and they had to pass on these ideas of republicanism and liberty and all those things. Individuals like Benjamin Rush from Pennsylvania is going to argue that women should experience some forms of education. By the time, so we'll move away from women, we'll look at race real quick. By the time of the Revolution in 1776, slavery had been in the American colonies for 150 some odd years. The founders, even though the Declaration talks about all men being created equal, is not going to apply to African Americans. African Americans to Thomas Jefferson at that point are seen probably as pieces of property. Both Jefferson and Washington are slave owners. The majority of the founders are definitely going to be, if not pro-slavery, at least not abolitionists. And so blacks were going to be seen as slaves or property in the American Revolution or the early American Republic. Native Americans, although there are Native Americans living east of the Appalachian Mountains and between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, they're going to have no place in the American Republic. And we'll see from 1780 until 1830, the conflict between westward expansion to the Mississippi River and the Native American Removal Acts. There's some ill feelings between the American patriots, or not the American patriots, the American citizens now at this point, and some of the Native Americans, and even some of the African Americans that fought alongside the British. Slaves that were held by members of the rebellion, and if they would leave their slave master and go fight for the British or support the British, were given their freedoms. And so a lot of slaves took advantage of this. Some Native American tribes fought for the British in hopes that they would be able to maintain at least some of their traditional grounds. And so that the colonists kind of harbored ill feelings, regardless of if an Indian tribe had stayed neutral or slaves had stayed loyal. There was still anchored towards that. Racism has shaped the views of African Americans, or just had shaped the views of Blacks in America. Washington and Jefferson owned large amounts of slaves. Jefferson believed that Blacks were inferior to whites. Took a slave as a lover, right, and had multiple children with that individual because she was a piece of property. You know, through the modern viewpoint, if we would look back on this relationship, we would see this as a rape or an instance of non-consensual relations between Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Jefferson does argue for the end of slavery in Virginia. He wants to create a land of yeoman farmers, small farmers. They're self-sufficient, but it's not like he wants to end slavery and give slaves pieces of the land. He wants to remove African slaves from the state. And Jefferson's vision of America as a nation of small white farmers living on small farms, beholden to nobody, able to create what they needed. Some slave owners did privately free their slaves. Manumissions is what that was called. After the war against Britain, some 10,000 slaves in Virginia were freed. More slaves are freed in the North. Societies are started to be formed in the North to bring about an end to slavery. But they're relatively new, relatively poorly attended. Benjamin Rush, who argued for the equal education of women, organizes the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. New York has a manumission society that works to educate Black children and raise funds to protect Blacks from kidnapping and being transported to the South, although slavery is still in practice in New York until I think it's 1830. In 1780, Massachusetts outlawed slavery, so there's steps in the right direction there. Several hundred slaves are still held in the state, and the state doesn't do anything about that. 36,000 slaves remain in the North, and New York State is the last northern state to end slavery in 1820. I'll talk about Native Americans briefly. The Treaty of Paris doesn't really address the natives at all, and all lands that were held by the British east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes were now given to the United States, and so except for Florida, which is owned by Spain, and so we have that's where we are. Okay. Many tribes have been neutral. Some had fought for the British, and the Americans took up arms against the natives to gain control of those new lands. We see in 1785 to 1795, you see fights between white settlers moving into like the Northwest Territories and the Native American tribes of the Midwest. The American settlers are victorious in these battles, and the natives relocate. After the what are we doing? After the American Revolution, you start to see this connection between tax-sponsored churches and individual states begin to disappear. You start to see what Jefferson describes as a separation of church and state. Virginia ended its connection with the Church of England after the Revolution. Pennsylvania had never had an official church. The New England states in their connection with specific churches. And so churches no longer are involved in government in the United States after that. The first form of government in the United States is the Articles of Confederation. From 1777 to 1791, the Articles were put in place. It's our first stab at self-government, and there's lots of problems. Some of the strengths of the Articles of Confederation are basically that it protects state rights. There's 13 colonies or 13 individual states. And these individual states would not look at themselves as states like we would see them. They would look at themselves basically as states, like countries. And so instead of a United States of America, you have a United Countries of America. So you have 13 individual countries that work together when they need to. It gives states the powers to protect individual rights, but it does not give the federal government very much power or leeway. There is a federal government that kind of oversees this confederation. It's going to deal with things like public lands and westward expansion. That's going to be, its main focus. It's going to put together the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is going to open up the Northwest or the Midwest territories to settlement. So places like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, the Big Ten states are going to be opened up to settlement. Slavery is going to be outlawed in those areas. And so that's kind of interesting, and that's going to come back, and we'll talk about slavery in those in the Northwest territories a little bit later as we get closer to the Civil War. Weaknesses: there's only one branch of government. There's no checks or balances. There's not an executive. There's a Congress that kind of meets. If you want to make any changes to the Articles of Confederation, you have to have 100% agreement among the states. The federal government couldn't regulate trade. It couldn't tax. Individual states were able to basically interact with foreign nations on their own. The debts incurred by the individual states had to be paid off by those states from the Revolution, which creates some situations where maybe a state can't pay back France as quickly as others, and so France would take over. There's a situation where France theoretically could take over the customs of Georgia within the United States, and so that's problems. And so we create this weak government that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily respect. The British are going to keep troops in their forts west of the Mississippi. Remember, the British are going to still control Canada. A lot of loyalists are going to leave the United States and move to Canada. The Spanish wouldn't allow the United States to ship goods down the Mississippi, which is problematic for farmers that are living west of the Appalachian Mountains because they can't get their crops to market. There's no money in the system because the federal government can't tax individuals. They can't tax states. They can't regulate trade through tariffs. And so they can ask for money, but no one's ever going to give it to them, right? The situation kind of comes to a head with an event called the Shays Rebellion. Okay, and so Shays Rebellion happens in the mid-1780s after the American Revolution, but before the dissolvement of the Articles of Confederation. And so basically, Shay is a farmer from Massachusetts. And farmers in Massachusetts and Western Massachusetts begin to borrow money from banks for expansion, for tools or whatever they need to buy the land, harvest crops, and those types of things. And as these loans become due, farmers don't have any money to pay them back because there's just no money in circulation in the American colonies. Everything's going to be barter systems or, for grain or whatever. And so the banks of Massachusetts begin to repossess farms. And Daniel Shay, who is a veteran of the American Revolution, leads a small group of armed men in rebellion against the state of Massachusetts. And basically, they rise up, they try to form their own little country, try to get recognition from France, and they're going to work again, kind of like form their own little poor man's republic. The governor of Massachusetts tries to call up a militia from other states to go out and put down Shays Rebellion. and none of the other states are willing to offer up men. And so the governor of Massachusetts actually has to pay for his own private militia using money from like wealthy merchants from the Boston area to gather up a small group of people, pay them, and the governor of Massachusetts actually leads the army out against Shea, and they put down the unrest. And so this really shows one of the problems of the Articles of Confederation, and the fact that you could have some kind of a rebellion within the country, and the states weren't going to be able to deal with it. If you didn't have a wealthy merchant class from Boston, then how are you going to stop Shea's rebellion from spreading other places? How are you going to maybe the wealthy merchants revolt in a state, and the wealth of the state turns against that state government? Who's going to come and help then? Who has that power? And so it's very obvious that the Articles of Confederation has some problems that need to be fixed. And so we hold what's going to be referred to as the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And the original goal of the Constitutional Convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation, make it better, give the central government more power. Rhode Island chooses not to send delegates to the convention, which automatically defeats the whole purpose of the convention, and the fact that to make a change to the Articles of Confederation, you needed 100% support from the states. And so if Rhode Island refuses to send delegates, then you can't make any changes. And so it becomes very, very, very clear that not only do we have to make changes, but we probably also need to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. And that's ultimately the decision of the Constitutional Convention, was to just throw away the Articles of Confederation and start from scratch. These meetings are held in private. They don't want the public to get wind of what's going on in Philadelphia during this hot summer. And that's where we get. So as we start to work through the Constitution, start to work up the Constitution, you start to have different ideas of how the government should look. James Madison is going to present something called the Virginia Plan, which is going to favor larger states. Virginia is a large, powerful state, and Madison believes that Virginia should probably be the driving force of this new American government because they have the most to lose compared to others. He argues for a bicameral legislature with two people or two houses, both houses being based on population. He argues for an executive branch and a judicial branch to complement the executive, and a strong government that can overrule state laws. William Patterson is going to propose something called the New Jersey Plan. New Jersey is a small state, it's very weak, and he argues that all states should have equal representation. We should have a unicameral legislature, which means one house, and the federal government should only have powers to tax imports. And so Richard Sherman is going to provide what's known as the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, in which it's agreed upon that we will have a legislative branch that will have two houses, so it will be bicameral. The upper house, which is the Senate, will be based on equality. So everybody will have the same number of seats in the Senate, while the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, will be based on population. So larger states will have more power in the lower house, but all states will be equal in the upper house. Slavery was another contentious issue during the the Constitutional Convention. The South argued that slaves should be counted as citizens, but not given citizens' rights. The North argued that if you did that, that you're giving too much political power to the South. There's some people in the North that probably want to get rid of slavery altogether at this point. Slave owners, the South argues basically that slavery is a burden on the Southern economy. because they have these people that they have to take care of. And so they argue that they should get tax credits and representation because of that. And so what's worked out is that we have this, where are we at? Oh, we have this 3/5 compromise. 3/5 compromise in which for every 5 slaves that were held in the South, 3 would count towards representation and 3 would count towards taxation. And so as long as the representation and the taxation rates were the same, everybody was pretty good with that. In the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention basically approves this 3/5 compromise. And we'll move forward. Northerners agree to the compromise because the Northwest Ordinance is passed, which outlaws slavery in the Northwest Territories like Ohio, Indiana, those types of places. When the Constitution is set to the states for ratification, most of the public is against it. Some people argue that that gives too much power to the federal government. We just fought this revolution to limit the power of central governments. And there's this massive campaign to drum up support that's taken. And the people that are in favor of the Constitution, they begin to refer to themselves as Federalists. People that are against the Constitution are called Anti-Federalists. Some of the more famous Federalists are like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison. These people are going to be typically property owners. They're going to be wealthy. They're going to be the movers and the shakers of the new country. Anti-Federalists are going to be like Thomas Jefferson, who want to see the country be small farmers and shopkeepers and laborers and yeomen. Jefferson is not going to be around during this time frame. He's actually going to be over in France as the ambassador to France from the United States. And both sides use newspapers and letters to publications to argue their points. The best example of this happens in New York State. At this point, by the time the collection of what's going to be known as the Federalist Papers are published in newspapers in New York, it's pretty clear that the Constitution is going to be ratified. The problem is that without New York and Virginia to sign off on these ideas, the nation's not going to have a whole lot of power behind it. And so anti-federalists argue that representation should be a true picture of the people, and the number of representatives shouldn't be so large that it should be so large that rich and poor people should get to choose the representatives, and if it's too small, ordinary people are going to get left out. And so this is, like your middle class farmers are never going to be chosen, and the government's going to fall in the hands of the rich. And this is going to be a government of oppression, just like the King of England. Hamilton argues that basically experience has shown that democracies of Greece end up being run by mobs, and that basically the new Constitution is not to make a rich man more eligible to serve in Congress than a poor person. That you're a bad person, that if you think someone that's wealthy or educated is bad, and that rich and poor are relatively the same. The way for this government to work is for everybody to have a similar voice. And that's where we are with Chapter 7. There's going to be a reading over Shays' Rebellion and a quiz that I'd like you guys to get done. And that's where we are. So then we'll see you in Chapter 8. Bye-bye.